So today we're going to talk about heroes and villains in your garden. And I'll just warn you as we go through, I have too many slides today. We were talking about it's hard being an entomologist for so long. You love this subject. You really want to include everything. So I am going to move kind of quickly through some of these topics. I'll stop and go slower on the topics that are more relevant to gardening and to our Master Gardener program here. And so just, follow along. And I think there is a handout. I'm not sure if Elena emailed it to you guys. It sounds like she emailed it to you. So don't worry about taking notes as we go through. You've got the notes. Just sit back and enjoy. Before we get started, I do just want to throw a shout out. This is Krem. She is an adorable foster dog that we're fostering right now. Unfortunately, we can only foster her short term. We're about to travel pretty soon. And so we're seeking an adopter for Krem if you're interested, or if you're interested in fostering her longer term, please do reach out to the South Pacific County Humane Society. She's been a really fun dog. So back into it, the first thing I want to make really clear, and I know Elena might have touched on this earlier too, is that the terms we're going to use today, beneficial insects and pest insects, these are anthropocentric terms. So these are terms that humans have designated to insects to kind of describe how they affect us in our lives. But I want to recognize that the insects, they're just going about their regular lives, right? Like they're just living the way that they know best. And also to recognize that these terms, they feel very black and white. Oh, it's a good guy. Oh, it's a bad guy. We'll get into this a little bit today, but there is a lot of in between. There's a lot of gray shades for insects as well. And so really just to recognize that even if it's a pest in your home, it has a real benefit potentially to ecology or to, the environment as a whole, even if it is kind of bothering you as a human. So first we're going to start with our bad guys, and we're going to talk a little bit about integrated pest management, which is what my specialty is in. I work specifically in cranberry and shellfish crops, and I do a lot of integrated pest management in my work. So first I'm going to focus on some of these insects you will know pretty often from your garden already, starting with the sapsuckers. So these are guys that have these piercing, sucking, needle-like mouth parts, right, where they're able to suck the sap right out of the plant. And so our first example are aphids. And aphids are these kind of short-lived insects. They're very soft and squishy. I just want to give you a few notes on identifying them because I found that folks sometimes have a hard time identifying them. You might know them much better. The one really critical piece here, I've circled it down in this little yellow guy down in the bottom there. If you see that little black point that's coming up out of the end of its abdomen or its rear, that's called a cornicle. And that's how we can identify aphids. All aphids are going to have two cornicles sticking up out of their butts. And that's how you can tell them from other insects pretty easily. I did put a winged aphid, or we call it an alate aphid, up there in the upper left-hand corner, just so you can kind of see, because sometimes those can throw people off. They tend to have a much smaller body when they do have those really mega wings. They put a lot of energy into those wings, so they'll look a little bit smaller, but those are adult aphids when you see those out in your garden. So aphids, of course, are an issue when they feed on your plants, but the main issue is that they make honeydew. And so honeydew is actually just, the aphid is just sucking on that sugar water, right? And so sugar water is very low in nutrition. There's nothing really there that's helping that aphid. So what it's actually doing is at the same time that it's drinking, it is peeing out as fast as it possibly can with a very special filter system. It's trying to make sure that all of the amino acids that are in that sugar water, which are very few, that it's just filtering just those amino acids and spitting out as much of that sugar water as it can, right? And so that's why they produce so much honeydew, is so that they can actually have enough nutrients to feed. And so typically what will happen is sometimes you'll get this honeydew on your plants, and then as a result you'll get mold growing on it. So things like sooty mold, which you can see in that right hand side picture there, these are pretty good cues that you might also have aphids in a plant, is if you see this sooty mold, which is growing on that sugar water that's being peed out. So another sapsucker, this is a relative, these are whiteflies. And so these are really teeny tiny little guys about the size of a grain of rice. They fly pretty readily. I feel like when I see these in my tomatoes, they're typically just kind of like a haze of flying little insects. And I want to point out, you can kind of see in these photos because they're up close, you have those large winged insects, but then you also have those little smaller yellow and even those little smaller translucent guys up there. So whiteflies are a little bit tricky to manage. Typically you have to manage them in what's called its crawler phase. And so that's that little translucent phase there. So essentially once you see those adult insects, they'll lay an egg, and then once it's a very small kind of agile little nymph walking around on the leaf, that's when you really want to kind of tackle it with any kind of pest management. The next insect I want to talk about are the thrips. These are kind of a sap sucker. This is actually starting to get a little more advanced in the evolution of insects. Instead of just sucking on the sap the way that aphids and whiteflies do, they actually kind of burrow their mouth parts. They've got much wider mouth parts, so they'll burrow them into the plant tissue. They actually are breaking up cells, and then they lap it up. So it's honestly like a little less finesse than an aphid uses. Typically you'll find these in flowers. So there's a photo there on the left hand side that shows what they look like in a flower, those tiny little guys. Sometimes you'll feel them biting you. I'm not sure if you've experienced that. They do give you a little nip. It doesn't do anything, but you can feel it. And so these are also pretty these can be an issue in the garden because they can cause some other types of damage. So here's an example of a strawberry, and this just has thrips damage on it. So that thrips had fed very early in the strawberry's life cycle, and so it can lead to this kind of like browning or this kind of this disfiguration essentially of the strawberry. And the same is true with flowers. Oftentimes we see thrips damage after it's occurred. So here's an example of a rose that had thrips damage, and you can see it's those very first petals because again that thrips had attacked this flower in its bud stage. And then also that lily that's there as well. You can see those white streaks are caused by thrips damage, again when it was in the bud phase and that thrips was eating, and then it expanded as the flower expanded out. So what's the thing that these three sapsuckers each have in common? They each vector or carry diseases from one plant to another. So sapsuckers on their own aren't really considered that bad of a pest. The issue is if you have one in your garden, the potential for them to carry disease increases, right? So these are some diseases you might be familiar with. In the top left-hand corner, that's tomato spotted wilt virus that's carried by thrips. I know I've got that one in my garden right now. Down below is the bean golden mosaic virus, which are carried by whiteflies. And then the dahlia mosaic virus is carried by aphids. I do want to point out that oftentimes you want to watch out where you're purchasing your plants from. You know this as well as I do. So start with clean material. You're less likely to have these issues. But if, for example, you did purchase a new dahlia and it came with mosaic virus, then when it's in your garden, it could carry it to the other dahlias if you had aphids in your garden feeding on that dahlia that was sick and then carrying it around. And so that's actually why we want to think about managing these pests, is if you have a disease that could be carried. So I'm going to just briefly touch on kind of insect physiology and how it's important thinking about pest management. So we breathe actively with our lungs, right? You take a deep breath in, you use muscles, you take a deep breath out, you're using muscles. Insects are not actively breathing. They don't have any muscles that are kind of managing. What they're doing is just through diffusion, they're allowing oxygen to come through these literally just holes in their body. They go down these tubes, and then the carbon dioxide will just diffuse back out. It's just very simple, basic physics. So it's a very simple system that's able to bring air into each of the cells of the body, literally just through these tubes. And so this is important. Here's a little picture of these. They're called spiracles. That's the outside hole, essentially, that leads to the tube. So you can see these circles pretty clearly on each of those segments of this. This is a picture of a mite in the lower left-hand corner. And so what's important is that these spiracles have these, we call them hydrophobic hairs. That means hairs that don't like water. So they really like oils and things like that. And so these hairs are actually able to keep debris and water out. And so anytime an insect is put into water, it's actually able to close those hairs. And then when the water is, when they come back out of the water, those hairs will just naturally open back up and open that tube again. Right? And so what's important about this, you think about it if you're setting up an insect trap, right? What do? We normally add a little bit of dish soap because that's actually breaking that hydrophobic barrier, right? And so that's exactly the same way that insecticidal soaps work. So I did just want to bring up that these insecticidal soaps, which are often used in gardens, what they're actually doing is they're breaking the hydrophobic barrier so that the holes that the insect uses for breathing are kept open, and so they're able to essentially drown, right? That's how the insect is killed with this product. It also helps to disrupt their feeding on those oil-covered surfaces. And these are really, let me just go back. These are really important to help with little insects like we had just talked about. So aphids, whiteflies, mealybugs, thrips, but also things like mites can be helped with insecticidal soaps. When the insect gets larger, that soap is no longer able to coat its spiracles or those holes, and so the product is not going to work as well. So just remember that these products really work best just for little insects. Next, we're going to talk about moth and butterfly pests. So I'm hearing some mm-hms. Yep, I've seen these in my garden. This is an image of diamondback moth damage. You'll often see them in your brassicas. That's a diamondback moth below in the lower left-hand corner. And then a cabbage white is another common one that I've seen. At least I've seen them in Georgia. I think you have them around here too. Oh yeah. um, so these are some pests you might manage, and I kind of wanted to touch on this one kind of organically registered product that a lot of folks have heard about. I get a lot of questions about this when I speak to the public, so I think it might be helpful for you to know a little bit about Bacillus thuringiensis. So this is a bacteria that's naturally found in the soil, and what's interesting about it is that it requires a high pH in order to function. So let me just ask my folks here in Ilwaco, what is the pH of our stomach? Is it acid or is it a basic? Do we know? Acid. Everyone's saying acid, exactly right. So a high pH is the exact opposite. Insect guts work the exact opposite of ours. They have a completely different pH of their gut. And so a lot of folks say, oh, I'm concerned about eating Bacillus thuringiensis. It cannot flip on in the high acid in our stomach. So that's one of the ways that this is really specific to insects as an insecticide. This works best in butterflies and moths. There's some versions that can work in beetles. There's others that are especially it's a special bacteria that can work with mosquitoes. So I have seen BT plugs to kind of drop into a body of water if you have mosquito larvae. But just keep in mind that this is really specific to certain groups of insects. So especially the one that you're spraying on your plants is oftentimes just for those moths and butterflies. And I do just want to bring up that there's really two methods of application for this. So oftentimes the organically registered product can be used as a spray, a granule, or a plug. Again, for standing water, that's typical in the case of mosquitoes. But BT has also been introduced into some transgenic crops, which are then able to produce BT proteins on their own. And so the insect essentially, when it's feeding on the transgenic or GMO crop, it gets that toxin and it dies, right? And the reason I'm bringing this up is this is another topic that I get asked about all the time when I'm out in public, right? I get asked about GMOs, and I just want you guys to have information about this. One of the things I do want to point out is there's a very limited number of GMO products that are for sale. So one of the concerns people have, one of my employees recently was telling me, I just don't know what to eat anymore. Everything's a GMO. And I said, gosh, that's not true. There's only, a very small number of crops that are actually GMO. And it's very obvious when you go to purchase them. So I've got two websites here. I just want to be clear, I'm not supporting any one of these websites. This is just for an example to show you what seeds will look like when they do have a GMO trait inside of them. So this is just a corn seed. I looked up a sweet corn seed because I know that corn is one of the few products that does have GM technology. So if we're looking here, I'm not seeing anything about GM. It just says it has early vigor. It says that it's an F1, so I know it's a hybrid. And so I'm not seeing anything here about BT traits or GMO traits. And that's in contrast to this other corn, which is on another website. And so this one specifically says, I've actually highlighted it down in the bottom there. Gosh, it's hard for me to read here though. But it specifically says that if you purchase this seed, they would like for you to fill out a contract in order to make sure that you are a good steward of the seed. And so specifically what they're referring to there is the transgenic genes within the seed. If you're purchasing a transgenic product, you will fill out a contract because they're trying to protect their technology. It's just like buying software. You have to sign that little form, right? Every time you open software on your computer. GM technology is the same. So I just want to be really clear to folks, you are not accidentally buying GMO seeds. You're going to have to, it's going to be a whole process. You're going to have to fill out a form for the EPA if you do. And so just feel rest assured and help let others know we're not concerned about GMOs, being purchased online readily. Another really great strategy for managing pests are sticky cards. What's really interesting about insects is they have kind of this series of cues that they'll use in order to find a plant. So most herbivorous insects are first going to use color. So when they're flying high in the sky, what they're looking for is a really nice green area. Except for insects, what they're actually reading is the yellow cue that is reflecting off of the green. So I know it feels counterintuitive, but it's that yellow that's really going to be strongly attractive to most herbivorous insects. And then once they clue into that kind of that yellow cue, they can see really from up above like, oh, this looks like a nice green field. Then they'll come down and they'll start to use other cues like smell and then like taste in order to determine whether or not to feed on a plant. So in this case, green leaves or yellow is really strongly attractive, and so that's why we use yellow sticky cards. I will point out that blue sticky cards can be helpful for some pests. For example, they're a lot more helpful for thrips. But I do want to point out also, and we'll talk about this, I think Eleanor will talk about this later, it's strongly attractive to pollinators, and so I would just be careful when you put sticky cards out. Notice how many pollinators are being stuck in them, and you might choose whether or not to keep them out. We're currently doing a very small sticky card project out in our cranberries, and we put them out to test, and we found that our blue cards just had too many pollinators, so we just pulled them out. We don't need to be using anything that's going to be killing too many bees. The next product you're going to hear a lot about, especially for organic gardening at home, is neem oil or azadirachtin. These are technically different. One of them is an extract. One of them is more specifically focused on the chemical. For our purposes, they're pretty similar. So neem oil and azadirachtin essentially have the same product in them. It is an anti-feedant. It is toxic to insects. It is made from a plant, so it is made from this plant that's pictured here. And the one thing I want to make really clear as we talk about all of these products is these can all kill bees, right? So we do want to be careful even when using oils, a little bit less so when using BT because it is so strongly specific, but using neem oil, azadirachtin, or the next product I'm talking about, these can be damaging to pollinators as well. So think about trying to treat at night when the pollinators are gone, and that way you have a full 12 hours before the sun comes up and those bees come back out for that product to kind of break down on the plant. So only the pests that are on that plant will really be hit with this product when you treat at night. The other thing I want to make really clear is to pay attention to the label, particularly the PPE or the personal protective equipment that you're meant to be using when you're using these products. These can be toxic products. I know that they come from plants, but they are still toxic. And so to just pay attention to what kind of, what should I be wearing when I use this product? And just remember that the label is the law. So even when you purchase, I'm assuming most folks here don't have a pesticide license like I do, but even the pesticides that you purchase from Home Depot, the expectation is that once you've purchased that, you are legally obligated to follow the law when you're applying that product. And so just remember that even though these are organic, they are toxic, and just to be careful with them and use them as the poisons that they are. And so finally, we'll talk about pyrethrins. These are also made from a plant, so these are made from chrysanthemum flowers. Again, these are highly toxic to bees and also to aquatic life. So be very careful that you do not apply these before a rain event or something like that. These break down pretty quickly in sunlight, and so this is a good one to use at night. So it has a little bit of a period to kind of work on those pests, and then in the morning when the bees come on, and it can be safe for them to come out and pollinate flowers again. And again, the same 2 points here, pay attention to the label, pay attention to the PPE. So now we're going to shift to talking about kind of the good guys in integrated pest management. Sure.
So this is, repeat the question. For mosquito larvae, do you have an opinion on using drops of Dawn dish soap to kill larvae and standing water?
Okay, so for mosquito larvae, do I have an opinion on using drops of dish soap or Dawn for killing mosquito larvae? I'm struggling with that a little bit. I think it depends on the situation. My concern about mosquito larvae would be if it's in an outdoor source, right? If it's a bird bath or something like that, that Dawn is then going to affect everything that visits that bird bath. And so I would hesitate a little bit to do something like that. If it's a water source that you think only mosquitoes are in and there's not a bird visiting, maybe it's like a bucket or a lip or something that's sitting there, it might be a little bit safer. But I would kind of caution that actually this BT plug that we had just discussed is far more specific to mosquito larvae than something like Dawn dish soap would be. Thanks. All right. So I kind of want to touch on the products that insects give us. We think about insects in a number of different roles, but one of the things that they do is they do provide us with a lot of products that we use, in our daily lives. And so from European honeybees, the reason these are so popular, right? They give us honey, they give us beeswax. And so beeswax has been really important historically. It was used as kind of one of the first ways to waterproof. It's used in fine violins and things like that. And so beeswax is still a really important product today for helping to repel water. They also help provide pollen, royal jelly, and even venom, which has lately been used in kind of allergy management. So if you can receive a microdose of honeybee venom to help with that. And they've also found that it might help with arthritis. And so some folks have also been seeking a very small dose, again from your doctor, to help manage arthritis symptoms in some cases. Another interesting product that we get from insects is called carmine red. And so this is a very special red dye that comes from this insect. It's actually a mealybug relative, and it lives on cacti. And so I was just out in Colorado visiting my sister, and we saw these all the time. When you're out in the desert, you'll often see these, and you can show your friends as kind of a fun party trick. Rub your finger on one of them, and you'll see that really dark red color from the mealybug. And so this was really popular as a pigment. It continues to be used as a pigment. And it actually made Spain tons and tons of money, right? They go to the New World and they discover this new red pigment, which is better and lasts longer than any of the pigments that they've had in the past. And it's amazing to look at art history before and after the discovery of this new pigment, because all of a sudden there's all of this art with this beautiful red pigment. So this is something that's really kind of transformed not only the art world, but also the economics of Europe and things like that in the past. And is still used today. I actually wore this scarf specifically. It is dyed with cochineal, or the dye that you get from this carmine red. And so it is still used today as a natural dye. The next product is silk. Oh, here we go. There's my other photo. And so this, of course, comes from these silk moths. This is actually one of the few domesticated insect species. If you see how fat that little moth is, it actually can't fly. So these were domesticated over time that they wouldn't fly away. They would just kind of sit around, be happy, and produce a lot of silk. And of course, the silk from these comes from those cocoons. I also want to point out shellac is another great one. This is, again, a natural waterproofing, and it's still used today. This actually comes from a lax scale. So that little insect on the far right-hand side, this is a type of scale, which is another pest you might find in your garden. But in this case, it has a waxy cuticle, which is protecting it, which can be kind of dissolved off and used as shellac. Insects are also really important as a food source. And so one of the things that's really interesting about insects is that when you introduce a large number of insects into an ecosystem, and we're now getting very kind of into the weeds with ecology here, but insects are able to add diversity to an ecosystem. So animal protein is easier to digest and higher in nitrogen than plant material. And so when you have a high number of insects in the environment, you're able to essentially add another order of animal. So this could be some apex predator. So essentially adding insects is able to add more energy into a system than plants alone could do. And so they create far more complex ecosystems. And so this is a little bit hard to wrap your mind around, but just to the point that, while insects might kind of bother us, they might be, we might think of them as pests at sometimes, they're also really maintaining these beautiful forests and prairies and all of these ecosystems that we love. Of course, insects are also used for nutrition by carnivorous plants. And then they're also used as protein by humans, right? Folks chuckle. I've had a number of these insects, actually. I've had all of the insects on the image here. I'm a little bit of a fan of trying things as I travel the world. But these have been a really important source of protein for humans historically, and are still an important source of protein for humans in other parts of the world, just not in the United States for whatever reason. Now we're going to focus on predators and parasitoids. These are some other ways that we kind of think of insects as beneficial, right, as kind of gardeners and folks managing plants. So there's some pretty main differences between predators and parasitoids. Predators, for the most part, are generalists, so that means they can feed on a number of different species of insects. A single individual predator can feed on multiple insects, and they're pretty easy to release and use. And I put a little asterisk there on your handout if you've got the handout in front of you. The one caveat I would hesitate here is ladybird beetles. So just so you guys know, if you ever purchase ladybird beetles, what happens in the natural ladybird beetle life cycle is that they actually migrate. So they'll go up a mountain and they migrate onto these trees, and so they're found in these massive quantities, just kind of literally coating the total surface of this leaf. And so it's very easy for people to go scrape them off the leaf and sell them to you instead of actually keeping them themselves in a greenhouse. And that's in fact how most ladybird beetles are sent to you. So I ethically have a problem with that because we're taking wild animals and then re-releasing them somewhere else. Part of the challenge with that is that once they're done migrating, they're not actually interested in feeding as soon as they come out of their kind of dormancy phase. First thing they'll do is they'll fly back down the mountain and then they'll look for somewhere to feed. So as soon as you take them out of the refrigerator, you pop the lid open, you release them into your garden, they actually don't stick around to feed. They have that cue to kind of go seek out that natural like down the mountain area that they go to. And so not only is it not going to work in your garden, it is also removing a really important ladybird beetle population in another state. And so I would just strongly caution against purchasing ladybird beetles in particular. Some other pests we can talk about, or some other predators, are better to purchase if you're interested in that. Parasitoids are different from predators. These essentially are either going to lay an insect in or on another insect host. A lot of folks kind of talk about them as zombies. They're zombifying insects. It is kind of true to an extent. What's really interesting is that when parasitoids put eggs in or on an insect, they actually do change their behavior. So the insect will act differently in order to kind of best suit the host or best suit the parasitoid after that point. What's really neat about these is that while they can be generalists, they can also be species specific. So this is something that is really prized in agriculture. If we receive a new invasive species from another country and they're thinking, gosh, how do we manage it? There's no predators, there's nothing native that's going to attack it. We can consider going back to the home country where they have potentially a species specific parasitoid and bring that over with the hopes that it will not kind of host shift and attack some of our native pests here. There's some challenges to that, but generally the idea has been it was really popular in the 1960s. It's really challenging now. I worked with a pest previously. They've been studying the parasitoids for 12 years now, and they still haven't found one that they're ready to release because they have been able to host shift. So they're usually species specific, but there's a little bit of wiggle room there. In this case, a single individual will lay eggs in multiple insects. So in this case, one wasp can kind of put several eggs into multiple hosts. And they can be really tricky to time to the host life cycle. So if you're considering purchasing these, they are a little bit trickier to put out than something like a green lacewing would be, which is just a predator, only because you do have to specifically time it to the host life cycle to make sure they both come out at the same time. And so some common predators, things like ladybird beetles up there in the upper left-hand corner. There's assassin bugs, which is the one in the upper right-hand corner. That's a green lacewing larvae in the lower left-hand corner. I mentioned those as well. It's going ham on some aphids there. Those are really, really kind of amazing predators, and that's really what I would suggest if you're interested in purchasing one, would be a green lacewing larvae. I do see them pretty commonly here. They come into my light traps and things, so I know that they also naturally exist here. So if you ever see one of those, in your garden, it's doing a lot of good work if you see that guy in the lower left-hand corner. And then also the minute pirate bug in the lower right-hand corner is another one that I've seen in my garden the last month. And so that's another great predator population to kind of maintain in your garden. Parasitoids are often wasps, but they can also be flies. And so there's 3 wasps in this image. The upper left, the lower left, and the lower right hand are each a wasp species. But that upper right hand is a trichogramma. That's actually a fly. And it's one of the most common ones that you can purchase online. And it's an egg parasitoid. So it's a teeny tiny little guy that'll go out and get eggs of some pests. And so what's amazing is you can kind of purchase these online, right? So this is an example of green lacewing larvae. I'll warn you, this presentation is really old, so these prices probably don't reflect inflation. But this is something that you could kind of purchase and release following their instructions. This is also a case, these are parasitoid release files. These are oftentimes used by agriculture because they're growing a lot of the same crop at the same exact phenology, and so it's much easier to release a parasitoid there. But these are very popular in agriculture, especially in organic systems. Next, I want to touch on decomposers. So termites are a pest that we often think about them as a pest in our homes, but I do want to make the plugs that termites are actually incredibly important in the natural ecology. We would not be able to have the forest systems that we see today without termites, right? And so what they're really doing is they're breaking down at a very macro level, so at a much larger level, they're breaking down the dead trees, fallen plant material to a point that, then mushrooms and bacteria and other systems can kind of come on and continue to break it down, right? So just in African savanna systems, as much as 20% of carbon mineralization may be due to termites. So they play a really outsized role in the ecology. And then of course later, bacteria and other things are able to come on and continue to break down this material. Coprophages are also really important. This is kind of native Australian fauna. We might recognize some of these guys, koala and a kangaroo up there and an echidna. And so what folks probably don't recognize is their poop. This is the poop for each of these species. Now, what's interesting is that Australia in the 1800s, was colonized by Europeans, and they said, oh, we've got all this rangeland. This would be perfect for livestock. So they brought their cattle in, and the cattle pooped and pooped and pooped, and nothing picked it up until there was a size of Australia, the size of Delaware, that was essentially covered in poop. So this was land that was completely unusable. I know that sounds crazy to us because we have natural decomposers here, but in Australia you can see just how small and dry that poop was. And so the natural dung beetles that they had in Australia did not know what to do with this really large wet cow patty. And so truly they literally had to keep moving the cows away and away because they would poop and you could no longer use the land. And so this became such an issue in Australia that finally in the 1960s, they introduced somebody to go save Australia by bringing in dung beetles from another country. And so this is Borna. This is a famous scientist in Australia. He studied 130 different dung beetle species, 43 of which were eventually released, and then 23 of which actually established. And so he actually received a medal from the Order of Australia in 2001. I think that's so funny, for saving Australia from poop. So coprophages are important. I didn't include this in the slides, but they're also really important to livestock production in the United States. These really nasty flies that will kind of feed on cattle here are actually living out their life cycle within cattle poop. And so one of the ways to best manage it is to get the poop off the ground as soon as it's laid. And so livestock growers, especially out west, will support these dung beetle colonies because by supporting them, they're able to take the poop off faster. And then this pest that's actually biting, it's causing all this irritation and biting the cattle, they're able to reduce it just through kind of benefiting these dung beetles. So thinking about how can we kind of think about ecosystem size effects of insects, right, to manage these issues. One other example is that insects also clean up dead animal carcasses. I decided not to show you any photos of those because they tend to be pretty gross. But just think about, vultures again are kind of picking up the large pieces, but then there's a lot of scrap still left there. And so insects are playing a really large part and helping to remove that dead animal tissue, which of course is full of diseases too, right? So it's really important to our ecology. And finally, we're going to touch on pollinators, which I know you'll talk about again this afternoon. But I wanted to talk on some fun little points here. So the basics of pollination we understand is that the plants are trying to move the pollen, right, and their anthers to the sticky stigma from, typically some other plant, right? So we can increase diversity, right? The whole point of pollination is to increase kind of sexual diversity amongst plants, to increase that genetic diversity amongst plants. And so there are different pollinators. There are bats and things that can pollinate, but the vast majority of flowering plants are pollinated by insects. And what's, as someone who works in agriculture, what's interesting to me is that pollination is really important to fruit set. So first off, you won't get many fruits if there's no pollination. But in addition to that, if you have bad pollination, so if the insect is only pollinating half of the flower, you get misshapen fruit like this apple here. So you can kind of see the apple on the left-hand side is misshapen. And the reason is when that side of the flower has not been pollinated, there is no seed, and that seed does not support as much flesh. So that might feel like a small thing, but to an apple grower, it's really critical. That apple on the left-hand side can only be sold as a low-grade apple. That's probably going to go for juicing, right? And so having not only pollinators, but having good enough pollinators to have a fully pollinated apple that's evenly sized all around, that's going to give them a better market advantage. And so honeybees are really great. They provide us with a lot of services, pollination services. They provide us, of course, with those other products that we just talked about. This is an almond orchard. Almonds, of course, famously can only be pollinated by these, these massive truckloads of honeybees. And so that's what's appealing about honeybees is that we can put them into these large colonies and we can kind of ship them around. And I put this picture up, and I think it looks a little bit scary. It's like, oh, there's this massive semi-load of honeybees, that's moving around the United States, right? It feels kind of weird. It goes against against this romantic notion that we have of honeybees. I can tell you now, working in cranberries, I mean, this is years after I made this presentation, these are so critical, right? So we had one of our honeybee growers drop out this year. His hives didn't make it through winter, and so they're down to one honeybee provider for the whole state right now for honeybees. And so our growers are so dependent on these people who come drive their honeybees around. And it doesn't, it doesn't look like this. Like, we know the guy's name, he's given me honey, he's great, right? And so this is really critical for supporting a lot of specialty crop, or a lot of these like nutritious crops that we like to eat. These honeybee deliveries are really, really important. And I would suggest driving by. I believe that they still have the honeybees out at the Cranberry Museum right now. So if you do want to drive by and just go see what that looks like, they've got a few hives out there you can check out. But what is really critical to note is that honeybees are not native, right? So we said before, this is the European honeybee. It is from kind of like Europe and Turkey area. And so what's important about this is that while this supports a lot of the crops that we have brought in from those regions, right? Most of the crops that we grow here in the United States are not native, although cranberries are. They're really able, they're best able to pollinate those things that are in their native range. And so there's a number of crops which are from the New World that honeybees really struggle to pollinate. One of them is blueberries, and blueberries are really a challenge. Honeybees can pollinate them, but they struggle to do so. In fact, they have to spend multiple seconds on a blueberry in order to be able to pollinate it as efficiently as a native bumblebee could. Tomatoes are the same. Pumpkins are really interesting. They have those flowers. You've probably experienced this, and the flowers will kind of droop in pretty early, right? So there's almost no entrance in that flower for a pollinator to get in. And so there's a special squash bee, which again has had through evolutionary history this ability to kind of work with that squash flower, and it's able to get in and pollinate it well and go to all of the additional pumpkins, right? And so honeybees, of course, are brought out to help support, pumpkin pollination, but they cannot do it as well as these native bees. Alfalfa is a really big one. Honeybees do a very poor job on alfalfa. They can do a decent job on these other crops, but alfalfa really depends on a ground nesting bee, right? We think of bees and, in hives and things like that, but there are also solitary bees that really like those just dead patches of earth that you have essentially to put their burrows into. And alfalfa is one of those. So they're putting in these large sand embankments to help just provide habitat essentially for these bees to help support their alfalfa crop. And bees, of course, are not the only pollinators. There's also flies, moths, and beetles that are also pollinating. And I want to point this out because folks a lot of times, we always talk about bees and save the bees. There is a growing amount of research that shows that potentially there might be more fly species pollinating than there are bees, which is really fascinating. We were just out in the cranberry fields, and of course it's bloom time right now, and we're sweep netting. So we're just picking up all the insects looking for some other pest species. And what's amazing to me is how many flies we're catching in our sweep net samples. I would say about half the insects we're catching are flies. So we don't have any information about it, but these flies are potentially also pollinating, right? So these are really critical, and you'll see them in your garden. One really famous example of that is the chocolate midge. And so this chocolate flower, which you can see, or cacao flower on the right-hand side, it has a very tricky flower to kind of get into. And so what they've found is that there's actually just this midge. It has to be 2 millimeters in size, so a very tiny little midge that's able to get up in there and pollinate. Nothing else is small enough or has the right buzz in order to be able to pollinate it. And this is one of the big challenges right now with growing cacao, is that these midges have become very hard to find. And they're concerned that they might really struggle to pollinate cacao moving forward if they're not able to support these little tiny flies that are so specific. I'll also point out yucca moths. In their native range, yucca are pollinated by this specific moth. And moths are pretty typical as pollinators if you have white flowers and if the flowers open at night. And that makes sense, right? Moths are night flying. And so yucca is one of those cases. And so what's really neat is that they're trying to protect yucca moths now in the native range because they have found that there's not as much genetic diversity of the native yucca because they have been losing some of these moths over time due to, development and all of that in the area. And then finally, another really famous one is this little teeny tiny weevil. And this is the only pollinator, again, oftentimes these crops can be really specific, right? There's only one pollinator that can do it. So palm weevil is one of these. This little teeny tiny weevil is the only pollinator of palm. And this has also been a challenge as palm oil has expanded around the world. And there's challenges here too about palm oil. It has, led to some deforestation of rainforests and things like that. I do have friends who work in palm oil, but it's also a pretty critical economic driver also for those economies, right? And kind of my last thing I want to touch on, this is something near and dear to my heart. Insects have also been really important model organisms for us. And so a model organism is just something that's really easily studied. It's something that's grown pretty easily in a laboratory. Drosophila melanogaster, it's that little fruit fly, right? But these are really important because these have been used for genetics, biology, behavior, ecology, sociology, physiology, toxicology work. I mean, the genetics that we know about ourselves first started with these insects. I know that's wild to think about. I had a friend who studied this little brown beetle over in the lower left-hand corner, Tribolium. A lot of the research that we're doing now about neurology actually comes from this little insect, right? Just because they're easy to keep in a lab. And so I do just want to really appreciate, the benefit that that gives for us as well, is having these insects be easy to rear also makes them easier to study. And that is the end of my presentation. I'd love to turn it over to get some questions.
No real questions, yet, but I
Yep.
want to invite questions from the different groups. And the one I wanted to offer right from the get-go is, as we speak to the public regarding pollinators and pollinator habitat, is there a one, two, three things we should be really emphasizing?
Yeah, that's a great point. Speaking to the public about pollinator habitat, I would focus on diversity in two ways. Diversity, you want to improve the diversity of the insects coming to your garden. And the way that you can do that is by improving the diversity of your plants, right? And so having more plants that have different shapes, different sizes, different colors, right? All of that's going to support more diversity. I think it's also really important, if you get deeper into the conversation, how can we extend the period of bloom? So one of the things that we have out at our cranberry garden is that we have winter blooming heather, so that the bees essentially that help support our cranberry crop can have something to feed on as soon as they come out in that really early spring period when there's not a lot of flowers. So those are the two things I would really focus on, is diversity and also extending that bloom time into the spring and into the fall.
If you want to speak quickly to your cranberry research, I mean, are there particular pests you're working for or beneficial insects that are going to impacting our cranberry crops?
Sure. So my research currently is focusing on two main cranberry pests, the black-headed fireworm and the cranberry tipworm. And what's challenging about them is they come out in spring right around the same time as bloom. So we had just discussed, being really careful about when we time our pesticides and things to avoid bloom. The cranberry growers are doing the same thing. If they don't get pollination, they don't get cranberries. So those protecting pollinators is their number one priority. And so it's like, how do you manage a pest that comes out during bloom time, when you would want to hit it? So we're looking at kind of pollinator-friendly products to help with that.
Question regarding using trap plants that attract aphids and other predators, honeysuckle, nasturtiums.
Sure. I think this can be really helpful, attracting, trap plants. I'll say I don't know as much about this. I worked a little bit with kind of trap plants or banker plant systems in a greenhouse setting, but it's easier because there's enclosed windows and doors, right? So I couldn't speak to which type of plants to use. What I think is helpful is kind of go out and check those trap plants and see, am I actually seeing evidence of, predation? Am I seeing evidence of parasitoids, right? And I know in my case, I've got a honeysuckle bush and it's awful. It's covered in aphids, but when I look closely at the leaves, I can see that the parasitoids have already started. I know that parasitoids are going to take a little bit longer to kind of build up their population and really be more successful, but I'm going to wait, instead of making a treatment, I'm going to wait seeing just a few parasitoid mummies, right? Knowing that they're going to increase their population. So I think that's critical too, is have those trap plants, but also kind of check them to make sure you do still have that population supporting.
We had a question regarding spiders. I know we're talking, insects and now spiders, but any thoughts regarding spiders as predator or friend?
So, I wish I'd read more about this. Spiders have become quite popular recently to study for this reason. We're finding out that they're extremely beneficial in farm settings and garden settings, certainly more than we had thought about before. One of the other things to keep in mind with spiders is that sometimes when they build their ecology, what will happen is the spider will feed, especially the bigger spiders in your garden, will feed on pests in your garden, but they'll also feed on other spiders. And so I do just want to support the idea that we should definitely be farming with spiders in mind. We should definitely support this population. But just understand you might see a lot of spiders out there because, part of that, if 20% of their diet, right, is smaller spiders, you do still have to have a lot of spiders in the garden to help with that. But they're definitely beneficial.
South Bend, you have your hand up. You want to unmute?
Yes, Laura referred to a handout earlier in her presentation. We're unclear if we already are supposed to have that, or is she going to send it, or what was she referring to?
You said you're sending it Monday? Okay, perfect. Elena just confirmed that she's going to send it to you guys on Monday. And I believe this will be a recorded, and I know that I can also send the slide deck to you as well.
Question regarding misconceptions about plants that are good for pollination, butterfly bush, for example. We have, miscommunications. The public might approach us and say, well, gee, I just planted this plant that I just butterfly bush is going to be great for pollination, not realizing that it is invasive.
So this is a complex conversation, and the first thing that I would kind of guard is like how invested is the person talking to you and kind of having this longer conversation, right? I try to focus on basics first. Natives are great, but I think just to this point, it's always important to plant native crops. It's always important to help support the native pollinators that we have here, especially recognizing, when I drive around, I see so many non-native crops, and I wonder sometimes where are the native pollinators going? We can't see anything that they're able to feed on anymore. And so I would just kind of gently remind folks if they're talking about, oh yeah, I've got a great butterfly bush in my garden. You say, oh, that's great. I'm so glad you're supporting pollinators. Have you thought about yarrow? Have you thought about some of these native plants as well? And we don't necessarily have to slap anyone's hand, but we can just say, some of these products can kind of help better and feel out that conversation and see, right? I think what's challenging with talking to the public is, they often have a limited time, attention span. And you also want to be careful that you don't scare them away from coming to talk to you in future, right? You want it to be a positive experience so they'll come back. And so as long as we're not, I've gone out with folks who will kind of shout people down and say oh, I can't believe you have a butterfly bush in your garden. But I think it's really important to kind of to approach this in a positive way and say how can we boost those native species, and then as the conversation continues or they come back to your stand the next week to really kind of focus on managing invasives as well.
So great question here. How are you using AI in pest management? How has that technology entered into your sphere?
Okay. I can't say AI has come to my particular little field yet. And I say yet, what's interesting is they actually have these, I don't know if you've experienced them yet. There's actually an agricultural chat bot, essentially, run by AI. It's out of Purdue, I believe. And the idea is you type in your extension questions and it'll answer them as an extension agent or perhaps as a master gardener. So I thought, oh, this is brilliant. I get such hard questions all the time. So I went in and I logged in and I just asked it the 3 questions growers had asked me that week. And it wasn't able to answer any of them. It gives kind of very broad answers. I think there's real potential there, though. As a master gardener, I think what's really helpful and what you can really focus on is that people side of it, right? We just talked about that. You can recognize if someone's still interested or if they're starting to pull back. You can recognize when it's time to really kind of push down and say, we should really focus on these native plants. AI won't be able to recognize that the way that you can. And so that's really the only place that I've seen AI appear. We are considering more drone work in cranberries, and I think AI might be helpful for that, but we're probably 10 years down the road for that.
And I know the whole focus today is on insects and on entomology, but can you talk a little bit about your green crab research, which is affecting a lot of people, and we're all much aware of it?
Yes. So invasive European green crab, we're pretty familiar with invasive species. And so this has been actually on Washington's coast for a long time. It's just entered Puget Sound. And so now there's this huge interest in kind of supporting research around it. And so my lab in particular is really trying to focus on what the impact will be to shellfish growers. And so we did some research. We kind of did a feeding assay where we fed the green crab some of the commonly grown shellfish products here in order to try and understand what it's capable of feeding on. The Cliff Notes versions, one of the things that was really surprising to us is we had really little crabs, we had really big crabs, and everyone, regardless of their claw size, was able to feed on what we call spat on shell, or the young version of Pacific oyster, shellfish, right? And so one of the concerns there is folks are just pulling really large crabs out of the bay, but these little guys can also do a lot of damage on that spat on shell, size, the young oysters essentially. So we need to be mindful of both of those sizes.
Are there particular concerns you have regarding new chemicals coming out and left residues of chemicals harmful to the environment overall?
That's a great and really complicated question. There's actually fewer chemicals coming out now than have come out in the past. And so, for example, there's one new mode of action that a company is working on, and it's still under wraps. They're still working on it. What's been exciting about new chemicals is that they tend to be much more specific than chemicals that have come before. Oftentimes, they don't have the environmental consequences of some of the products that have come before. And so, what I guess I would say, not that I'm concerned about new chemicals. I think what's fantastic is it takes 10 years for a new pesticide to go from the lab to being out in a grower field. And that 10 years is just, an intensive amount of research, an intensive amount of oversight, an intensive amount of regulation that's involved in that. And I think that's critical to keep, but I think it's also critical to to have these products for growers to use. To me, it's all about affordability, right? Cranberries have a lot of great nutrients. I hope that everyone can afford these nutritious products, right? I hope everyone can buy vegetables at the store. And so that's kind of why I support those types of products.
So with respect to IPM techniques, right, we are taught, of course, chemicals, of course, are an option, but a final option, and so forth. How does that play out in terms of cranberry cultivation and in terms of the, cultural, mechanical, other bio methods for pest management?
Right. So the differences between organic and and we would say like conventional agriculture, there's several different stages of differences. That's one of them. Is oftentimes organic can try to, I wouldn't actually say that they wait for the pest to be an issue and then decide whether or not to treat, because a lot of these things have to be baked in at the beginning. You have to be considering cultural control, years in advance in order to really be able to maintain these insect populations at a level that you could then, reduce insecticides or whatever the case may be. Organic products are just a completely different list of products. In cranberries, I know our growers are really kind of considering how to best, make sure that their pesticides are not affecting pollinators. How can we potentially reduce insecticides, because they're costly? Thousands of dollars on a field, right? So if they can reduce an insecticide, and we're talking about that right now for one of the pests that we have, why wouldn't you save a few $1,000s a year per acre, right? And so the thing that's really been kind of shown to me, especially working with the growers here, is that they're not just spraying willy-nilly. All of this stuff costs money, so they're really interested in kind of like really judiciously, is the pest in the field? So they're scouting for it. Is it at a level where I actually need to treat? So they're looking at the threshold, and then they're making a determination of whether or not to treat. What's challenging about cranberries in particular is there are very few organic cranberry growers. And so in this state, there's one cranberry grower currently that I know of who's still kind of trying to make a stab at it, but also has very low yield reductions, because of it. The same is true. So Quebec has some of the largest organic cranberry growing farms in the world right now. Quebec is really kind of leading. And unfortunately, those growers have gotten fed up growing cranberries that they'll actually switch them back to conventional for 5 to 10 years so that they can kind of reduce the populations of insects that have gotten so bad, and then they might consider putting them back into organic production. So this idea of, organic being like this perfect, this land has been organic for 100 years, organic agriculture at a large scale, it doesn't exist like that, unfortunately.
And of course, it wouldn't be a presentation with you if we didn't ask about your past employment at Disney, and how has your experiences here contrasted now with when you were doing horticulture at Disney World?
Sure. I think greenhouse management is actually a lot more similar to garden management. You deal with like a diversity of plants, and that's kind of nice, right? Because you have this ability to remove the plant one year if things aren't working. Heck, my pumpkins are so rough this year, I'm not sure if I can continue. And so like within a garden setting, you can really kind of think about managing like, okay, this pest has gotten so bad here. Can I just remove this plant for a year or two, give my garden a break and bring it back in? And I think what's hard about cranberry crops is it's perennial. And I have growers who've had plantings for 85 years. So the weeds that are in that field are the weeds that are in that field. At this point, you can't really manage them. And so it's really kind of considering the longevity of a crop versus, having a garden where you can rotate much more easily.
Other questions from different sites? This is a tremendous opportunity to have Laura here with us and to have us present in our 2-county community, supporting ag that supports hundreds of jobs, and close to $100 million, by the way, in combined cranberry and shellfish economic impact.
So some of the homegrown recipes or just these urban legends that won't die, and is there any further information we can use to help dispel that?
What do you mean by home?
For like pesticide control and insecticide control, just some of the homegrown recipes that are just this urban legend.
Sure, I'm getting a question about, sometimes there's kind of homegrown recipes or even like urban legends about how to manage pests and how do you mitigate that as a master gardener. I see this in two lights. I have a sister and I love her dearly, and she kind of follows some of these homegrown methods. And she calls me about them all the time. And I usually try to weigh in my mind which is more dangerous, right? Because oftentimes I like to see it almost as a placebo effect. Is the product that you're putting out, is it super toxic? Then I want to kind of step in and remind you, some of these products are toxic. You might want to be really careful about putting bleach in your garden, right? That was something that I've heard people practice, is they use bleach for weed management. That's really toxic. I've heard folks talk about using salt for weed management. That's going to really ruin your ground for a long time, right? So I think about the longevity of it. If they're talking about using apple cider vinegar, it's not going to harm the environment as much, and so I kind of weigh it in that way. Like, what's the toxicity of the product that they're talking about? And I'll steer them in the right direction. We have research on some of these products. We don't on these others, potentially for a reason. But I found that folks that kind of adopt these homegrown, recipes, and oftentimes TikTok, right? TikTok is really spreading a lot of this type of misinformation. I see a lot of young gardeners really focusing on these. I think it's just important to understand that if you keep wagging your finger, no one's going to want to listen. And so part of that is also just listening, like, why do you think that, apple cider vinegar is helping? And just kind of, I think also being compassionate with folks who are interested in those. Yeah.
So, are mosquitoes ever considered like a good bug? Do they do any good at all?
This is a tricky question. Are mosquitoes ever considered a good bug? Do they do any good at all? It's actually considered at an ecological level that they are negligible. So the idea is like, yes, there are some insects that feed on a lot of mosquitoes, but they could feed on fungus gnats. They could feed on other things. Like the birds and things that feed on mosquitoes could feed on other insects instead. The other idea to this is that I've heard that mosquitoes are kind of like taxing. So the idea is that like when they drink your blood, they're like taxing higher order predators, and they're kind of releasing it right in the form of their poop, quite honestly. So they're releasing those nutrients back. And that's true for all parasites, right? Like they're helping to kind of maintain this, all of these animals within our ecosystem. And that's true, but I think to the argument, if we're thinking about large term, how do we manage mosquitoes when they're causing, major diseases in humans and animals and things like that? How bad would it be to remove mosquitoes? We don't see a huge ecological effect. Although there's actually technology that would work better just to cure the mosquito of things like malaria or dengue instead of removing it from the population. That was a long answer. That's a great question. I would say kind of in my international travels, one of the things that I've learned is that, the insects are interesting and the science will get you so far, but you really got to be compassionate. You know, I've done integrated pest management in coffee farms in Ecuador, and it's really hard as an outsider kind of walking in and again wagging your finger telling people you're doing that wrong. I've learned no one wants to hear that, you know. One of the experiences I had was in Laos. They were talking about mosquito management, and one of the key places you get mosquitoes are in rubber fields because they have these cups of water literally on every tree, and so the mosquito larvae inside. And one of the key ways to get rid of it is just to wear long sleeves. But the growers don't want to because it's hot. And it's understandable, right? And so I think a key part of kind of like, you know, speaking to the public about insects is kind of having this compassion and recognizing like it is really hot in Laos. I understand why you don't want to wear long sleeves, right? But here's kind of the effect of not doing so. So just, you know, listening.
And the clock is fast. But indeed, I think we are at a point at which
We can thank you for your presentation, for your discussion. The time now for all the classes to break to your small group discussions. And we'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.